Hi, and welcome to our video lesson on Frankenstein and Blade Runner. This segment will be suitable for Year 12 advanced students who have these texts set for study. So how do you make a comparison between two texts in time? The first thing is to always list and consider the older text first in the paragraphs of your essay. This is for two reasons. One, it makes more chronological sense, and two, the older text may have influenced the younger text, so there may be a relationship there as well. So when you look at the text, you should be thinking about your text context and values and the overall message of each text. And as I go through talking about contextual values today, you might want to take note of any text that I mention, direct references or indirect references, because you may find yourself wanting to quote those as historical facts later in your essays. So first we're going to look at Mary Shelley, who is the author of Frankenstein. She is born in 1797. Her mother was Mary Wollstonecraft, feminist, educator and philosopher, who wrote a text called A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. Now this is a really interesting text. So feminism was a brand new concept, and Wollstonecraft argued that women weren't actually mentally inferior to men, which was widely believed at the time. So she said that it wasn't that they were naturally inferior, but that women didn't get educated the same way that men did, so in comparison they always seemed dumber. So in her book she argued that women ought to get educated to the same level as men. Mary's father was William Godwin, who was a philosopher and a writer in his own right. Mary Wollstonecraft died several days after the birth of Mary Godwin as complications from childbirth. Afterwards, Mary didn't quite receive the education that her mother would have wished for, but at least she did have some home tutors. Many intellectuals also visited the Godwin residence, including the Romantic poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who is actually directly referenced in Frankenstein as well. Mary met the radical poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, who again is referenced in Frankenstein, and that happened through the relationship that Shelley had with her father. So Shelley visited Godwin and the two were very good friends, as Godwin's radical politics influenced Shelley, much to the chagrin of Shelley's conservative family. Shelley agreed to bail Godwin out of debt, but his family wouldn't give him the money because they thought he was going to spend it on something frivolous like charity, which of course he was going to. So this created a rift between the two as Godwin felt quite betrayed, and so they stopped being friends. However, the 17-year-old Mary and Percy began to meet in secret. Percy embodied her father's ideals, such as marriage being a repressive tradition, which Godwin argued in Political Justice in 1793. But later he retracted that and became more conservative as he got older. But as far as Mary was concerned, Percy was just like her father. In 1814, the couple secretly left for France, leaving Percy's unfortunate pregnant wife behind. As they travelled, Mary and Percy read works by Wollstonecraft and by lots of other writers, and kept a journal of their own writing jointly. And a lot of the material that they covered in this time is a big influence on what was written in Frankenstein. When Mary returned, she was pregnant. Now this was a big taboo in the 1800s, and a lot of people saw being pregnant outside of marriage as a big sin. So she and Percy were penniless, and Mary's father refused to acknowledge her. Mary lost her premature baby. At the same time, an ecstatic Percy had a baby with his, wife. So this created a fairly uncomfortable position for Mary to be in. Mary then had another child with Shelley that was called William. In 1816, Mary, Percy and their son travelled to Geneva. At this point, Mary began referring to herself as Mrs. Shelley, even though the two weren't really married. And at this time, again, it was a very conservative time, but a lot of the romantics believed more in a free-spirited, free love approach, which wasn't necessarily taken on board by other people, so that caused conflict as well. Then they spent the summer with the poet Lord Byron. Byron was a bit of a character in this time period. He was highly influential to the later romantics. He was from higher class, and he also styled himself to have a very enigmatic personality. He used to dress in black, be brooding, and was fairly, probably what you would call the first emo. So they discussed galvanism, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and the experiments of Erasmus Darwin, who is said to have animated dead matter, that is, bring something that was dead back to life. So be careful when you talk about Darwin, because we don't mean Charles Darwin, the famous evolutionist, but we do mean someone related to him. Erasmus Darwin was actually his grandfather. So just make sure when you're talking about this in your essay, you don't get the two scientists confused. So Shelley and the gang amused themselves by reading German ghost stories, which prompted Byron to suggest that each of them write their own supernatural tale. At this point, Mary conceived the idea for Frankenstein, and this is a statement she made about the meaning and the inspiration for her novel. I saw the pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing it had put together. I saw the hideous phantasm of a man stretched out, and then, on the working of some powerful engine, showed signs of life and stir with an uneasy, half-vital motion. Frightful must it be, for supremely frightful would be the effect of any human endeavour to mock the stupendous mechanism of the creator of the world. So from this quote we can see that one of Mary's primary aims is to reject the idea that humans should be able to play God. Dealing with life and death is supposed to be a matter strictly for the creator. So then she began to write the novel Frankenstein, or the Modern Prometheus. And we'll have a talk about the story of Prometheus later on as well. So at this point, Percy and Mary, who was pregnant again, got married in 1816. This was after his first wife's suicide, and in an attempt to get custody of Percy's other son. So a lawyer advised the two that the best hope they had for getting custody was to present a more respectable appearance to the court, and this is what prompted them to get married. In 1817, Mary finished Frankenstein, which was published anonymously in January 1818. Now, the reason it was published anonymously is because it's very unlikely anyone would have read the novel or taken it seriously if they'd known it was published by a woman. The public assumed that Percy was the author, since the book was dedicated to his political hero, William Godwin. Of course, they didn't put two and two together and realise that Godwin was Mary's father. Unfortunately for Mary Shelley, the rest of her life was fairly miserable. She lost more children, she had to deal with the fact that Shelley had an awful lot of love affairs, and also that he was constantly getting chased by the debt collectors. She was devastated when Shelley drowned in a boating accident and never took another husband. She devoted the rest of her life to writing, getting Shelley's poems published, and providing for her one remaining son. So that tells you a little bit about Mary, and it also tells you about the kind of ideas that were floating around at the time and what might have been put into Frankenstein as a result. So now we're going to look at the two influencing eras on the text. The first one being the Age of Enlightenment, which took place in the 1700s, and then we're going to have a look at Romanticism, which was the influence of the 1800s. So Mary probably aligns herself more strongly with the Romantics, but you kind of have to know what they're reacting to if you want to understand what the Romantics are about. So, the Age of Enlightenment. Basically, this era was about applying reason and science to divinity and nature. So it tends to be linked with the scientific revolution, which is when we had a lot of scientific breakthroughs all at the same time, and figures such as Isaac Newton. Now, we mention him because he's particularly important. He came up with the idea of natural law that said that the forces and objects in the universe were controlled by principles, they weren't just mysterious and unknowable. So it tended to be a time of essayists and philosophers and a lot of rational thinking and writing. This particular type of thought and the idea of natural law was the movement created a framework that the American and French revolutions adopted. So basically the idea was that if natural objects had rights and laws, then the same thing applied for human beings. And this became the foundations for democracy. So one influential thinker that influenced the Enlightenment was Descartes. So his thinking tended to influence the idea that the monster struggles to come to terms with his existence. The major idea that you would want to reference in your essay is cognito ergo sum, I think therefore I am. And this tends to be part of his quest to define himself. So if you think about it, the monster doesn't come about through any kind of natural processes. He's just put together, so he's not born the way that other creatures are, and he doesn't really have all of the learning experiences and the slow learning curve that a child would. So he just wakes up one day and he has a mind and a consciousness, and it's very hard for him to know what to do with it. Descartes was also responsible for an idea called mind-body dualism, which allowed humans to see themselves as different from other creatures that only had a body because they had a mind or a soul. So Descartes liked to separate the idea and pretend that the mind and the body were different things, rather than recognizing that the brain is in fact part of the body. So scientifically not that sound, but it created the way for people to have prejudice against things like the monster, because even though he does have a body and probably very clearly a clever mind, he can't be said to have a soul because he wasn't created by God. Another philosopher you may want to reference in talking about the novel is John Locke. So he was an English philosopher and what we'd call a liberalist who influenced Rousseau, who is another major philosopher we're going to talk about. He contributed the idea of tabula rasa, or the blank slate of the mind, which means that the human being is not born with any innate knowledge or any knowledge of good and evil or anything like that. Everything comes to us through experience. So you can see that very obviously the monster is born tabula rasa, and he's influenced by the text that he reads. So he gets hold of John Milton's Paradise Lost and a couple of other books, and he reads them, and he also observes the family, the French family that he hides living next door to. And that's a lot of what forms his early mind. So then we come to Rousseau. Rousseau was a philosopher, writer, and composer of the Enlightenment, whose philosophy was very influential on the French Revolution. He came up with the idea of the social contract, which suggests that rulers had responsibility to their subjects. So the idea was that once upon a time, people followed the king because they thought that was what God wanted. But when the idea of the social contract came around, there was responsibilities for the individual serving the king, but there was also responsibilities for the king serving the people. So if we put it in modern day context, we pay taxes to the government, but the government provides us with roads and a police force and education in terms of schools, that sort of thing. And if the government stopped doing that, well then perhaps we wouldn't have to obey them. So you can see this idea in the fact that Victor creates the monster, but he doesn't really do anything in terms of governing it or helping it to grow. This idea is further backed up in Rousseau's Philosophy of Education, particularly in a book called Amélie, which was produced in 1762, which also dictates that a tutor should gently lead his pupil to develop morality through reason and experience, without letting any harm come to him. So this is the idea that the process should be a gentle one, and they should be allowed to respond to things in the natural world and learn as they go. But of course the monster doesn't get that opportunity. So this becomes another way that Victor lets him down. He doesn't help him to develop any morality, so how can he think that the monster is going to be anything but a monster? And then we come to another influence, which is Galvani. So Galvani was an Italian physician, which is another word for a doctor, and a physicist. In 1771, he made a discovery that the muscles of a dead frog would twitch when they were struck by a spark. So he observed the frog's leg twitch. He came up with a theory to explain this, was that the leg must somehow contain animal electricity. And he described all of this in a text called On the Effect of Electricity on Muscular Motion. Now that's a text that Mary Shelley claimed that she was reading when she was staying with the others in Geneva. So Galvani was the first investigator to appreciate a relationship between electricity and animation, or life, but he kind of got it the wrong way round. He thought that the electricity was something that was naturally stored in animals, but what had actually happened was the scalpel he was using to dissect the frog was one that he'd been using earlier when he was using an experiment about static electricity. So the scalpel had picked up a charge and given the electricity to the frog rather than the electricity coming from the frog. However, the idea was circulated widely and the phenomenon was dubbed galvanism. And obviously that leads to the idea that the monster could have been brought back to life in the first place. That's the end of this segment. Please continue on to the next part of the lesson where we'll talk about Romanticism.